Tonight, we step into a world where the line between medicine and madness blurred like smoke through candlelight. A world where monks brewed potent ales in stone monasteries, where wise women mixed ointments that promised flight, and where eating the wrong bread could send an entire village into convulsions and hallucinations. This is the story of getting high in medieval times. Before we begin this journey through forgotten pharmacopoeias and ancient intoxications, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Sometimes these stories keep you awake, and other times they guide you gently into dreams. Either way, I'm grateful you're here. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable. Let's explore together what it meant to seek altered consciousness in an age of plague, prayer, and perpetual twilight. When we think of medieval Europe, we often imagine a world of knights and castles, of crusades and cathedrals. What we rarely consider is the chemical landscape of that world, the substances that medieval people consumed to escape pain, to find ecstasy, to touch something beyond the grinding poverty and brief brutality of their lives. The truth is, medieval people got high. They got very high, and the ways they did it, the things they experienced, and the reasons they sought those experiences tell us something profound about what it means to be human. The medieval period stretched roughly from the 5th century to the 15th century, though these boundaries are more fluid than rigid. This was a time when life expectancy barely reached 30 years for many people. Disease was rampant and poorly understood. Pain was a constant companion. The church dominated every aspect of life, promising salvation in the next world, while this one seemed designed for suffering. In such a world, is it any wonder that people sought escape? Is it surprising that they searched for substances that could offer a few hours of relief, of joy, of transcendence? But the medieval relationship with intoxicating substances was far more complex than simple escapism. There was no clear distinction between medicine and recreation, between healing and getting high. A substance that could ease the pain of a broken leg could also transport you to vivid hallucinations of demons and angels. A drink that was safer than contaminated water also happened to make you drunk. The plants that wise women used to treat ailments were often the same plants that could send you on journeys to other realms, or kill you, depending on the dose. Medieval people lived in a world where the supernatural felt immediate and real. Demons lurked in shadows. Saints performed miracles. The boundary between this world and the next was thin as parchment. When someone consumed a substance that produced visions, those visions were not dismissed as mere hallucinations. They were experiences that might reveal divine truths or demonic temptations. The altered state was not separate from reality. It was another form of reality, perhaps more real than the mundane world of mud and hunger and endless labor. So, as we explore the substances medieval people used, the experiences they sought, and the consequences they faced, remember that we're not just talking about drugs. We're talking about how an entire civilization understood consciousness itself, how they navigated the space between the physical and the spiritual, how they coped with a world that was often unbearable, and sometimes, in moments of grace or intoxication, unutterably beautiful. Let's begin with the most common intoxicant of all, one so ubiquitous that it was barely considered a drug at all. The first thing you need to understand about alcohol in medieval times is that it was everywhere. When I say everywhere, I mean that ale flowed through medieval life like blood through veins. It was consumed at breakfast with the afternoon meal and before bed. Children drank it, monks drank it, kings drank it. The poor drank it because they had little else. The rich drank it because they could afford the best. In Britain, during the 1300s, adult males commonly consumed 1 to 2 gallons of ale per day. Let me repeat that, 1 to 2 gallons per day. That's not an exaggeration or a myth. That's documented historical fact. To put it in perspective, that's roughly 8 to 16 pints of beer every single day. Now, before you think every medieval person was staggering drunk from dawn to dusk, you need to understand that medieval ale was not like modern beer. It was weaker in alcohol content, often around 2 to 3%, sometimes even less for what was called small ale or table beer. It was also nutritious, full of calories and vitamins that a diet of bread and gruel often lacked. But it was still alcohol. Even at lower percentages, consuming that much ale every day meant that many medieval people lived in a state of mild, constant inebriation. The edges of the world were always slightly soft. Hunger pangs were dulled. The cold seemed less biting. The priest's sermon about hellfire felt a little less terrifying. Life, in short, was more bearable. Medieval people drank different things depending on their social status and geography. Ale was the drink of commoners in England and northern Europe. It was made from malted barley or other grains, mixed with water and fermented with yeast. Before hops became common in the 15th century, ale was flavoured with a mixture called grut, which could include all sorts of herbs like mugwort, yarrow, heather, and even henbane. Yes, henbane, that poisonous plant we'll discuss more later, was sometimes added to ale to make it more intoxicating, to give it an extra kick that went beyond simple drunkenness into something stranger and more potent. Beer, technically distinct from ale by the addition of hops, came later to much of Europe, but quickly became popular because hops acted as a preservative. Beer could last longer than ale. It could be transported more easily. It could be stored. The Germans perfected beer brewing, and by the 1200s, cities like Hamburg had thriving brewing industries that were sources of civic pride and economic power. Wine was the drink of the wealthy and the church. Grapes grew well in France, Italy, Spain, and parts of Germany, and wine was imported to places like England for those who could afford it. Wine carried prestige. Serving wine from France or the Mediterranean showed that you were a person of means, someone with connections to the wider world. Wine was also essential for the Mass, for the transubstantiation of Christ's blood, which gave it a sacred dimension that ale and beer lacked. The best wines came from monasteries, which had the resources, stability, and viticultural knowledge to produce superior vintages. Vinum theologium, the wine of theologians, was famous throughout medieval Europe. Mead, fermented from honey and water, was common in areas where grain was scarce or where honey was abundant. The Welsh, who were more herders than farmers, drank mead. The Vikings prized it above all beverages, imagining their heaven as a place where dead warriors fought all day and then retired to Valhalla each night to feast on roast pork and drink mead served by beautiful Valkyries. Mead could be potent, especially when it was mixed with herbs or spices. Some early medieval recipes for what was called beor suggest drinks that were closer to strong mead than to ale, with alcohol contents approaching 20%. These were drinks that could truly alter consciousness, that could transport you from the mundane world to somewhere else entirely. Cider, made from fermented apples, was drunk in regions where apples grew well, places like Somerset in England, Normandy, and Brittany in France, and Asturias in Spain. Cider provided a local, seasonal alternative to grain-based ales and was just as capable of producing intoxication. But alcohol's role went far beyond simple drinking. It was medicine. When you had a fever, you might drink wine mixed with herbs. When you couldn't sleep, you took ale with lettuce or poppy. When you were in pain, alcohol was often the only anesthetic available to you, short of the more dangerous sedatives we'll discuss later. Alcohol was also food. Ale was sometimes called liquid bread, and for good reason. It provided calories, carbohydrates, and nutrients that might otherwise be missing from a peasant's diet. In a world where food security was never guaranteed, where famines could strike without warning, ale was sustenance. The production of alcohol was primarily women's work. Brewsters, as they were called, brewed ale in their homes for both domestic consumption and small-scale commercial sale. In one English village, about 60% of all families earned income from brewing or selling ale. Brewing was one of the few trades open to women, and successful brewsters could achieve a measure of economic independence rare for medieval women. The image of the wise woman tending her cauldron, mixing herbs into bubbling brews, is not just a fairy tale. It's rooted in the reality of women who controlled the production of one of medieval society's most essential commodities. Taverns and alehouses were central to social life. London had an estimated one alcohol vendor for every 12 inhabitants. Think about that ratio. In a city of 12,000 people, there were roughly 1,000 places to buy alcohol. These establishments were more than just places to drink. They were where news was shared, where deals were made, where community bonds were forged and sometimes broken. They were also places of ill repute, associated with gambling, prostitution, and violence. The medieval publican had a bad reputation for fraud and dishonesty, watering down ale or selling spoiled stock. Regulations attempted to control quality and price, but enforcement was spotty at best. Drunkenness was widespread in all classes of society, but it was particularly noted among the clergy and university students. Leading ecclesiastics like Anselm, Bede, Boniface, Dunstan and Wycliffe protested against the repeated inebriation of priests and monks. Gregory of Tours wrote in the 6th century that wine had replaced ale as the popular drink in Parisian taverns, and also documented the repeated drunkenness of clergy. Despite religious condemnations of excess, despite sermons about temperance and the sins of the flesh, medieval people drank and drank heavily. Monks, paradoxically, were some of the most prolific brewers and drinkers in medieval Europe. The monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland, which built one of the first significant breweries, allowed each monk 5 quarts of beer per day. Monks maintained viticulture, improved grape varieties over generations, and produced the best wines in Europe. They brewed virtually all beer of good quality until the 12th century. They had the education, the resources, the stability, and the motivation. After all, beer and wine were safer than questionable water, and they were necessary for the rituals and sustenance of monastic life. The effects of all this drinking were exactly what you'd expect. People got drunk, they got violent, they got amorous. They made poor decisions, they vomited in the streets, they passed out in taverns, they woke with pounding heads and swore they'd never drink again, then started all over when the sun reached its zenith. In adulterating alcoholic beverages, medieval Scotland made it a crime punishable by death, which tells you both how common fraud was and how seriously people took their drinking. But beyond the simple drunkenness, beyond the slurred speech and unsteady gait, alcohol in medieval times served a deeper function. It softened the edges of a hard world. It created spaces where social hierarchies relaxed slightly, where a peasant and a merchant might share a bench and a jug. It provided moments of joy in lives that offered precious few such moments. When you're cold and hungry and your back aches from dawn to dusk labour, when you've already buried 3 of your children and you know you probably won't live to see 40, a few pints of ale can feel like grace itself. Not escape, exactly, but relief. A reminder that life, even medieval life, could sometimes be more than mere survival. And for some people that wasn't enough. They wanted more than the mild buzz of ale. They wanted something stronger, something that could take them further from themselves, further from the world. For that, they needed different substances entirely. When a medieval surgeon prepared to amputate a gangrenous limb, when a healer needed to set a broken bone, when a patient writhed in agony from a bladder stone that couldn't be removed, something more than ale was required. They needed sedation. They needed pain relief powerful enough to allow them to perform invasive procedures on conscious human beings. They needed what medieval physicians called stupefactives, substances so potent they could render a person unconscious or so deeply sedated that they wouldn't remember the saw cutting through their flesh. The most famous of these medieval sedatives was called the Great Rest. The name alone tells you something. Not sleep, not unconsciousness, rest. The kind of rest that was otherwise impossible in a world of unending pain. The Great Rest appeared in one of the most influential medical texts of the Middle Ages, the Antidotarium Nicolai, compiled in 12th century Salerno. This formulary was considered the Bible of compound pharmacy in medieval Europe. Its use was mandatory in some medieval states, and its most powerful preparation combined 3 plants that had been used to manage pain and induce sedation since ancient times: opium, henbane, mandrake. Each of these plants alone was dangerous. Together they created something that walked the knife's edge between effective medicine and lethal poison. But medieval physicians understood something that modern medical historians are only now beginning to appreciate. These plant combinations, worked out through centuries of trial and error, through countless patients who lived or died based on dosage and timing, actually worked. They worked remarkably well, in fact, when properly prepared and administered. The alkaloids in opium, primarily morphine and codeine, are powerful analgesics that work by binding to opioid receptors in the brain and spinal cord. They reduce the perception of pain and create feelings of euphoria and relaxation. But opium alone, especially the raw opium available in medieval times, could be unpredictable. Too little and the patient still felt pain. Too much and breathing stopped. Henbane and mandrake, both members of the nightshade family, contain tropane alkaloids like scopolamine and hyoscyamine. These compounds have very different effects from opiates. They block acetylcholine receptors, which produces sedation, amnesia, and hallucinations. They create a dissociative state, a feeling of being separated from your body, of floating above yourself. In small doses, this is useful. In larger doses, it's terrifying. In even larger doses, it's fatal. But here's the fascinating thing that modern pharmacological analysis has revealed. When combined, these substances work together in ways that may have actually reduced the risk of overdose. The henbane, with its dissociative effects, would kick in within 20 minutes, creating a sense of detachment that made repeated self-administration unlikely. You wouldn't reach for more because you'd already be separated from your body's pain signals. Then, perhaps 30 to 40 minutes later, the morphine from the opium would fully take effect, providing deep pain relief that could last for hours. The combination created a window of anesthesia that was sufficient for surgery, but less likely to lead to fatal respiratory depression than opium alone. Medieval physicians didn't understand pharmacokinetics or receptor binding. They didn't know about blood-brain barriers or half-lives. But they knew from experience that this combination worked, that patients who received the Great Rest often survived procedures that would otherwise have killed them from shock and pain. They knew that the dosages mattered, that every ingredient had to be measured carefully. The surviving recipes are precise about proportions, about preparation methods, about how to store the mixture and how long it could be kept before losing potency. Another famous medieval anesthetic was called Dwale. English manuscripts from the 12th through 15th centuries contain numerous recipes for this herbal anesthetic. A typical Dwale recipe combined bile, hemlock, lettuce, opium, henbane, and vinegar, sometimes with added bryony root. The mixture would be soaked into a sponge and held to the patient's nose to induce unconsciousness. When the surgery was finished, a sponge soaked in vinegar would be used to revive the patient. Think about what this means. Medieval healers had developed inhaled anesthetics. They understood that different routes of administration produced different effects. They knew that the fumes from heated substances could be absorbed through the lungs more quickly than substances taken orally. They had, in essence, developed a form of volatile anesthesia centuries before modern medicine would discover ether and chloroform.
And
The experience of receiving these sedatives must have been both terrifying and transcendent. Imagine you're a medieval patient lying on a table in a monastery infirmary or a healer's cottage. You're about to have your leg amputated because gangrene has set in and there's no other way to save your life. You're held down by strong hands. A sponge is pressed to your face, soaked in a mixture that smells of herbs and something darker, something chemical and strange. You breathe in. Within minutes, the world begins to change. The edges of your vision blur. The faces of the people around you elongate and distort. You feel a strange lightness as if you're rising off the table. The pain in your leg, which has been your constant companion for days or weeks, begins to recede. Not disappear exactly, but move away as if it belongs to someone else. You hear voices, but they sound distant, echoing. You try to speak, but your tongue won't obey. Then a deeper layer of sedation takes hold. The room spins and tilts. You see things that aren't there, or that might be there in some other dimension of existence. Angels, perhaps, or demons. Your dead mother calling your name, the Virgin Mary weeping. A great darkness opening like a mouth. You fall into it, not with fear, but with something like relief. And then, nothing. A void. The great rest. Hours later, perhaps, you wake. The leg is gone. The pain remains, but it's different now, a ghost pain, a phantom limb. You're alive. Against all odds, you survived. The mixture of plants that should have killed you instead saved you, or at least gave the surgeon the time needed to do his work. You'll never quite remember what happened during those lost hours. You'll have fragments, images, sensations, but they won't quite cohere into a narrative. For the rest of your life, you'll carry the memory of that journey to the edge of death and back, that chemical voyage into unconsciousness. For the healers who administered these substances, the knowledge was sacred and dangerous. They knew they were working with poison. They knew that the line between cure and death was measured in drops and grains. One medieval text states that drinking 4 flowers of henbane could induce severe symptoms in a small child, potentially fatal symptoms. The margin for error was razor thin, and yet the alternative was often worse. Without anesthesia, surgery was brief, brutal, and traumatic. Speed was essential. The less time the patient spent conscious while being cut, the better their chances of survival. But speed also meant less precision, more damage, more risk. So medieval healers chose the risk of the sedative over the certainty of trauma. They mixed their potions, said their prayers, and hoped. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the patient woke. And sometimes, despite their best efforts, the patient never woke at all, sliding from sedated sleep into final silence. The healers would mark this in their records, adjust their recipes, try different proportions next time. Medieval medicine was an art refined through centuries of death. We should talk about opium specifically because it occupied a unique place in the medieval pharmacopoeia. Opium, the dried latex of the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, had been known since ancient times. The Sumerians called it the joy plant. The Egyptians used it extensively. Greek and Roman physicians wrote about its properties in detail. Dioscorides, in his 1st century text De Materia Medica, described opium's uses for pain relief, sleep, and the treatment of various ailments. This knowledge was preserved and transmitted through the Middle Ages, copied and recopied by monks in scriptoria, translated from Greek to Arabic to Latin. But there was a problem. Opium poppies grew best in hot, dry climates, places like the Mediterranean, the Middle East, Central Asia. Northern Europe, with its cold, damp weather, wasn't ideal for poppy cultivation. While some poppies did grow in places like England and Germany, and while some opium was produced locally, it was generally weaker and less consistent than imported opium. The imported product, brought along trade routes from the East, was more potent but also more expensive and less available, especially in times of war or when trade routes were disrupted. This meant that opium occupied a somewhat elevated position in medieval medicine. It wasn't the common remedy, it was the powerful remedy, the one you turned to when other treatments failed, when pain was unbearable, when sleep was impossible. Physicians prescribed opium preparations for everything from coughs to diarrhea to insomnia to the agonies of terminal illness. Patients who could afford it sought it out. Those who couldn't made do with weaker preparations from local poppies or turned to other plants entirely. The effects of opium were well understood. Physicians knew it dulled pain. They knew it induced drowsiness and eventually sleep. They knew it could cause constipation and reduce respiratory drive. They knew that taking too much would kill you. What they described in their texts suggests they also understood the euphoric component, the sense of well-being and contentment that opiates produce. Medieval writers sometimes describe opium's effects in almost poetic terms, talking about how it eases not just physical pain but the pain of the soul, how it brings a kind of peace that nothing else can match. For someone living with chronic pain in medieval times, and chronic pain was common due to injuries, untreated conditions, and the simple wear and tear of hard physical labour, opium must have seemed miraculous. Imagine living for years with a back injury from a fall, with joint pain from arthritis, with the lingering agony of poorly healed broken bones. Every movement hurts. Sleep is fitful and brief. You can't remember what it felt like to be comfortable in your own body. Then someone gives you opium. Within an hour the pain recedes. Your muscles relax. A warmth spreads through your limbs. For the first time in years you feel almost normal. More than normal. You feel good. The world seems softer, kinder. Colours are richer. Sounds are more beautiful. You understand why the Sumerians called it the joy plant. But medieval physicians also warned about opium's dangers. They knew that people could become dependent on it, that the body built tolerance requiring larger and larger doses to achieve the same effect. They knew that sudden withdrawal could be agonizing. They knew that opium could be used for suicide, that a large enough dose would send someone into a sleep from which they'd never wake. The boundary between medicine and poison was always present in medieval pharmaceutical practice, but with opium, that boundary was especially fraught. There's limited evidence for purely recreational opium use in medieval Europe, at least compared to later centuries. Opium was expensive. It was often adulterated or of variable quality. It was primarily seen as medicine, not as something you'd take for pleasure. But we should be cautious about drawing too firm a line. Medieval people didn't think about recreational versus medicinal use the way we do. If something made you feel better, whether that was easing physical pain or emotional distress or simple boredom, it was serving a purpose. The idea that pleasure is somehow separate from health, that feeling good is frivolous, is more modern than medieval. So, when a medieval person took opium for pain and found themselves floating in euphoric bliss, when they discovered that all their worries and fears had temporarily dissolved, when they experienced hours of peace in an otherwise turbulent life, were they using medicine or getting high? The answer is both. They were doing both. And medieval physicians, for the most part, understood this. They knew that opium's value wasn't just in its ability to stop pain signals, it was in its ability to make existence bearable. This understanding extended to the other plants in the medieval pharmacopoeia, particularly the nightshades. And here we enter stranger and darker territory. The nightshade family, Solanaceae, contains some of the most dangerous and fascinating plants in the medieval world. We've already mentioned henbane and mandrake as components of sedative preparations. But these plants, along with their relatives belladonna and datura, had uses and effects that went far beyond simple sedation. They were hallucinogens. They were deliriants. They could transport you to other realms entirely, or at least make you believe you'd been transported. And the experiences they produced were unlike anything we associate with modern recreational drugs. Let's start with henbane, Hyoscyamus niger. This plant grew naturally throughout Europe, thriving in disturbed soils, waste places, and along roadsides. It was common enough that most people would have known it by sight, recognizing its funnel-shaped yellowish flowers marked with purple veins and its fuzzy leaves that gave off an unpleasant odor when bruised. Every part of henbane is poisonous, containing tropane alkaloids that affect the central nervous system in profound and unpredictable ways. Henbane had multiple uses in medieval society. As we've discussed, it was a component of surgical anesthetics, but it was also added to beer. Archaeological excavations at Celtic sites have found henbane seeds alongside evidence of brewing, suggesting that the practice of adding this plant to alcoholic beverages goes back at least to pre-Roman times. The henbane would have made the beer significantly more intoxicating, not just increasing drunkenness, but adding a layer of altered perception that alcohol alone couldn't provide. Drinkers would have experienced not just the familiar effects of alcohol, but also the dissociative, hallucinogenic effects of the tropane alkaloids. The world would have become strange and dreamlike. Solid objects might have appeared to breathe. Distances would have been hard to judge. A tavern might have felt like it was expanding and contracting like a lung. And beyond the visual distortions, there would have been mental effects, a sense of detachment from normal consciousness, perhaps mild paranoia, certainly confusion. Some accounts suggest that henbane was deliberately used for its psychoactive properties, burned so that its smoke could be inhaled. Ancient Greek priestesses at the Oracle of Delphi may have breathed henbane smoke to induce the trance states in which they delivered prophecies. In medieval times, similar practices likely persisted, though they would have been hidden from church authorities who viewed such things as witchcraft. The writer Gustav Schenk, in a controversial experiment in 1966, described inhaling smoke from burning henbane seeds. He wrote of being seized by a dizzy rage, of feeling his feet grow light and expand, of a sensation of flying accompanied by vivid hallucinations of clouds, beasts, falling leaves, and rivers of molten metal. His description matches what we'd expect from tropane alkaloid intoxication, a delirium in which the boundary between perception and hallucination dissolves completely. The experience Schenk describes sounds terrifying, and often it was. Tropane alkaloids don't produce the euphoric, consciousness-expanding trips associated with psychedelics like psilocybin or LSD. Instead, they produce delirium, a state in which you can't distinguish what's real from what isn't, in which you might have entire conversations with people who aren't there, in which you might believe you're somewhere else entirely. You lose the awareness that you're intoxicated. You don't think to yourself, I'm hallucinating. You simply experience an alternate reality that feels completely convincing until it suddenly shifts into something else. This is important to understand. When medieval people used henbane, either medicinally or recreationally or ritually, they weren't escaping into pleasant visions. They were entering a state that would be clinically classified as toxic psychosis. And yet, they did it deliberately. Why? Part of the answer lies in context and expectation. If you grew up in a culture that believed altered states could bring you closer to the divine, that visions were messages from God or warnings from demons, then a henbane-induced delirium wasn't just a bad trip. It was a genuine spiritual experience. The visions weren't hallucinations to be dismissed. They were revelations to be interpreted. The terror wasn't a side effect. It was the devil testing your faith. The sense of flying wasn't a delusion. It was your soul temporarily freed from your body. Medieval sources describe people who used henbane experiencing sensations of levitation, rapid movement, and transformation. These descriptions would later be echoed in early modern witchcraft testimony, in confessions extracted under torture from women accused of flying to Sabbaths on broomsticks. We'll return to that connection shortly. But first, let's consider henbane's cousins. Belladonna, Atropa. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, was perhaps the most dangerous of all the nightshades. Even its names speak to this duality. Belladonna means beautiful woman in Italian, referring to its cosmetic use by Renaissance Italian women who would put drops made from the plant into their eyes to dilate their pupils, creating a striking, seductive appearance. But the genus name, Atropa, comes from Atropos, one of the three fates in Greek mythology, the one who cut the thread of life. Beauty and death, both contained in one plant. Belladonna contains extremely high concentrations of atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine. Even slight contact with the plant can cause skin issues. Eating a single leaf can be fatal for an adult. The shiny black berries, which look appealingly like large blueberries, have killed countless children throughout history. Adults who have ingested belladonna by accident or by suicidal intent describe horrific symptoms: a racing heart, extreme dryness of the mouth and throat, inability to swallow, severe confusion, terrifying hallucinations, and convulsions. Death, when it comes, is often from cardiac arrest or respiratory failure, and it's neither quick nor peaceful. And yet, belladonna was deliberately used, both medicinally and otherwise. In tiny, carefully controlled doses, it could dilate the pupils, relax muscle spasms, and reduce certain types of pain. Physicians used it cautiously, aware that the therapeutic dose and the lethal dose were frighteningly close. But beyond medicine, belladonna had another reputation. It was one of the key ingredients in the legendary flying ointment of witches. Mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, completes this trinity of nightshades. If henbane was common and belladonna dangerous, mandrake was legendary. Medieval lore about mandrake was extensive and bizarre. The plant was said to scream when pulled from the ground, a scream so terrible it could kill anyone who heard it. To harvest mandrake safely, you were supposed to tie the plant to a starving dog, and then lure the dog away with food, so the dog would pull up the plant while you covered your ears. Mandrake was said to grow beneath gallows, nourished by the bodily fluids of executed criminals. It was said that the root naturally grew in the shape of a human being, with a body, arms, and legs. Some of this lore was fantasy, elaborated over centuries of retelling. But the root really does sometimes grow in a vaguely humanoid shape, forked in a way that suggests limbs. And mandrake really was extremely dangerous to harvest and use, so perhaps the warnings about screaming roots were a way to ensure that only those with proper knowledge and courage would attempt to gather it. Mandrake's effects are similar to those of belladonna and henbane, though perhaps less intense per dose. It causes sedation, hallucinations, and a sense of dissociation. Medieval texts describe it as a powerful anesthetic, useful for surgery when properly prepared. They also describe it as an aphrodisiac, which is interesting. The tropane alkaloids don't actually increase sexual desire, but they do create a sense of euphoria and reduce inhibitions, and the hallucinations they produce can have erotic content. If someone took mandrake expecting it to enhance sexuality, the dissociative state and the power of suggestion might well create experiences that felt sexual, even if the pharmacology doesn't support actual aphrodisiac effects. Mandrake, like the other nightshades, was expensive and difficult to obtain. It grew in Mediterranean regions primarily, so in Northern Europe it had to be imported or substituted with other plants like bryony, which was sometimes called English mandrake despite being botanically unrelated. The rarity and legendary status of mandrake made it highly prized in magical and medicinal contexts. A mandrake root might be kept as a talisman, believed to bring luck and protect against evil. It might be added to love potions or transformation rituals. It was a plant of power, a plant that connected the human and supernatural worlds. Together, these three nightshades, henbane, belladonna and mandrake, formed the foundation of what became one of the most notorious substances in medieval and early modern European history. The flying ointment. The flying ointment of witches is one of those things that sits uncomfortably between history and legend. Did it really exist? Did people really make ointments containing deadly nightshades and then apply them to their bodies believing they would fly? The answer appears to be yes, though the full story is more complex and more human than the sensational accounts suggest. The first mentions of ointments used in connection with beliefs about flying appear in the 1300s. Roland of Cremona, writing in the 1230s, mentioned an unguent related to orgiastic flying. Johannes Hartlieb, in 1456, was the first to describe in detail the use by witches of flying ointments. By the Renaissance, numerous accounts exist of these preparations, including from physicians who analysed them. One of the most detailed accounts comes from Andres Laguna, physician to Pope Julius III, writing in 1545. Laguna described finding a jar of green ointment taken from a woman accused of witchcraft. When analysed, the ointment was found to contain hemlock, nightshade, henbane and mandrake, mixed with a fat base. A Dominican priest had watched a woman apply this ointment and then fall into what appeared to be a trance. When she awakened, she claimed to have been transported to a Sabbath where she had participated in wild revelries with demons and other witches. What was happening here? Several factors need to be considered. First, the method of application was crucial. These ointments were absorbed through the skin, particularly through areas where skin is thin or where there are mucous membranes. Historical accounts suggest that the ointments were sometimes applied to the armpits, the inner thighs, or even vaginally. This transdermal absorption allowed the active compounds, the tropane alkaloids, to enter the bloodstream without passing through the digestive system. Why does this matter? Because eating these plants was far more dangerous than absorbing them through the skin. When you ingest nightshades orally, the alkaloids pass through the stomach, where the acidic environment and digestive processes can make poisoning more severe and unpredictable. The gastrointestinal distress alone, the vomiting and diarrhea, could kill you through dehydration before the neurological effects even fully manifested. But transdermal absorption, while still risky, bypassed much of this. The alkaloids entered the bloodstream more gradually and more predictably. The dose was easier to control, at least for someone with experience. Second, the fat base of the ointment served a purpose beyond just mixing the plant materials. The tropane alkaloids are lipophilic, meaning they dissolve in fats and oils. Mixing them with fat, whether from animals or from plants, made them more readily absorbed through the skin. Medieval people didn't understand the chemistry of lipophilic compounds, but they knew from experience that mixing their plants with fat made them work better when applied topically. Third, the psychological and cultural context shaped the experience profoundly. If you were a medieval woman living on the margins of society, perhaps a healer or midwife, someone who had knowledge of plants and their properties, you existed in a dangerous position. The church was suspicious of anyone, especially women, who possessed knowledge that seemed to bypass clerical authority. Wise women who could ease childbirth, who could end unwanted pregnancies, who could heal illnesses or cause them, were both necessary and threatening. In such a context, the use of powerful psychoactive substances might have served multiple functions. On one level, they were simply medical treatments. Ointments containing nightshades were used for pain relief, for treating menstrual cramps, for easing the agonies of childbirth. Applied to the lower abdomen or vaginally, they would have provided real relief through the anticholinergic effects that relax smooth muscle. But these applications also meant that the alkaloids were being absorbed at fairly high doses. high enough to potentially produce psychological effects. On another level, these ointments might have been deliberately used for their mind-altering properties. If you were poor and couldn't afford wine or imported opium, if you were socially isolated and starved for any kind of transcendent experience, creating an ointment from plants you could gather yourself and then applying it to fly, to leave your body, to escape your circumstances, even for a few hours, that might be worth the risk. The fact that the experience was often terrifying, filled with demons and darkness, doesn't mean it wasn't also sought after. Terror can be transcendent. Horror can be holy. In a world where the supernatural was constantly present, where demons and angels were as real as your neighbors, a vision of the Sabbath was as valid as any other religious experience. The accounts of what people experienced under the influence of flying ointments are remarkably consistent, which suggests they're describing real pharmacological effects rather than pure fantasy. People describe sensations of lightness, of their bodies becoming insubstantial. They describe feeling as though they're rising off the ground, floating, then flying through the air at tremendous speed. They describe transformations, believing they've taken the form of animals, usually wolves, cats, or birds. They describe arriving at gatherings in dark places, forests or mountaintops, where crowds of people they don't recognize are engaged in wild dancing, feasting, and orgiastic sexuality. They describe encountering a dark figure, sometimes described as a man, sometimes as an animal, who presides over the gathering and who demands their allegiance. When interpreted through the lens of Christian demonology, these experiences were proof of witchcraft, proof that the person had made a pact with the devil and was attending Sabbaths where Christian values were inverted and mocked. When interpreted through the lens of modern pharmacology, these experiences are consistent with anticholinergic delirium. The sensations of flying, the transformations, the vivid hallucinations of complex social scenes, the confusion of what's real and what isn't, the amnesia and distorted time sense, all of this matches what we'd expect from a large dose of tryptane alkaloids. But there's a third interpretation that's perhaps most accurate. These experiences were real to the people having them. The flying ointment produced a genuine altered state. That altered state was then interpreted through the cultural frameworks available. If you believed in witches and Sabbaths, if you'd heard stories about such things all your life, if you applied an ointment expecting or fearing that you might fly, then the delirium produced by the nightshades would crystallize into a narrative that matched those expectations. You weren't just hallucinating random images. You were having an experience that your culture had prepared you to recognize and name. The association of these ointments with broomsticks is particularly interesting. Broomsticks weren't just cleaning implements. They were household items associated with women's work, with the domestic sphere. They were also, in some folk traditions, phallic symbols associated with fertility. The image of the witch flying on a broomstick might be a garbled memory of women applying ointments to broomsticks and then using those broomsticks as applicators, particularly for vaginal application. This would explain the recurring association between broomsticks and flying, and it would make pharmacological sense. Vaginal application would allow for high-dose absorption through mucous membranes, producing more intense effects than application to normal skin. The Church's response to flying ointments and the women who used them was brutal. The witch trials of the early modern period, which peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries, but which have roots going back into the medieval period, targeted primarily women who were accused of using such substances and participating in Sabbaths. Tens of thousands of women were tortured and executed. Their confessions, extracted under unimaginable pain, described in detail the ointments they made, the Sabbaths they attended, the demons they served. How many of these confessions were true, in the sense that the women really had used psychoactive ointments? How many were pure fantasy, the product of torture and leading questions? We'll never know with certainty, but it seems likely that at least some women really were using nightshade-based preparations for medicine, for pain relief, and perhaps also for the experiences those preparations produced. And it seems likely that those experiences, filtered through fear and through the expectations created by church teachings about witchcraft, were then confessed as proof of demonic pacts. The tragedy is multi-layered. Women who possessed valuable botanical and medical knowledge were persecuted. Plants that had legitimate therapeutic uses were demonized. And the boundary between healing and harming, between medicine and magic, which had always been porous in medieval thought, was forcibly redrawn by authorities who saw any unauthorized knowledge as heresy. But there's one more substance we need to discuss in this survey of medieval intoxication, one that came not from deliberate use, but from terrible accident. And the experiences it produced were perhaps more horrifying than anything the flying ointments could conjure. Imagine you're a peasant farmer in 10th century France. You've just harvested your rye crop, the grain that will sustain you and your family through the coming winter. The harvest was difficult. The summer was cold and wet, not ideal for growing, but you made it work. You've threshed the grain and stored it. You've ground some into flour and baked it into bread. The bread is dark and dense and a little bitter, but you're grateful to have it. A few days after you start eating this bread, you notice something strange. A tingling in your fingers and toes. A sensation like insects crawling under your skin. You feel restless, unable to sit still. Your muscles twitch and spasm. Then the burning begins. Your hands and feet feel like they're on fire, but when you look at them, there's no flame, no visible burn. The pain is excruciating. You pray to God for relief, but none comes. Over the following days and weeks, your extremities darken. The flesh turns black. It feels cold to the touch, but continues to burn with internal fire. Your fingers begin to fall off one by one. Your toes drop away. If you're unlucky enough to survive this long, your hands and feet follow, leaving you permanently mutilated. And through all of this, you have visions. You see demons dancing in the corners of your vision. You hear voices speaking words you can't quite make out. Time loses meaning. You might dance for hours without realizing it, caught in convulsive movements you can't control. You might see angels or devils, might believe you're in heaven or hell or some terrible place between. This is ergotism, known in medieval times as St. Anthony's fire, the result of eating grain contaminated with the fungus Claviceps purpurea. The fungus grows on rye and other cereals, especially during cool, damp growing seasons. It produces structures called sclerotia, dark purple or black growths that look like distorted grains or like the spurs on a rooster's leg, hence ergot, from the Old French word for spur. These sclerotia are packed with ergot alkaloids, complex molecules that include ergotamine and ergometrine. Ergot alkaloids are extraordinarily dangerous. They cause severe vasoconstriction, constricting blood vessels so tightly that blood flow to the extremities is cut off completely. This produces the burning sensation, St. Anthony's fire, and eventually leads to dry gangrene as tissue dies from lack of blood. The alkaloids also affect the central nervous system, binding to receptors for serotonin and dopamine, producing hallucinations, delirium, and convulsive episodes. There are two main forms of ergotism, and individuals might experience one or both. Gangrenous ergotism is the form that causes the burning and the blackening and the loss of limbs. It was more common in chronic lower-level exposure. Convulsive ergotism produces seizures, muscle spasms, violent convulsions, and intense hallucinations. It was more common in acute higher-dose exposure. Either form could kill. Both forms destroyed lives and communities. Ergotism was endemic in medieval Europe, particularly in regions that relied heavily on rye bread. Northern Europe, with its cold, wet climate ideal for both rye cultivation and ergot growth, was especially affected. Major outbreaks are recorded throughout the medieval period. In 944 CE, an outbreak in southern France killed as many as 40,000 people. In 1094, another outbreak in the same region killed thousands more. The medieval chronicler Geoffroy de Breuil of Vigeois described mysterious outbreaks in the Limousin region of France, where people's limbs turned black and fell off while they writhed in agony. Medieval people had no idea what was causing this. They saw the symptoms, the burning and gangrene and convulsions and hallucinations, and they interpreted them through the lens of their beliefs. Some thought it was divine punishment, God's wrath visited upon sinners. Others thought it was witchcraft, curses laid by enemies. Still others thought it was demonic possession, especially when they saw the convulsions and heard the victims' babbled visions of demons and monsters. The association with Saint Anthony came about in a specific way. In 1095, a French nobleman named Gaston of Valois had a son who was suffering from the disease. The young man was in agony, his limbs swollen and burning. In desperation, Gaston brought his son to a church that held relics of Saint Anthony of Egypt, the 3rd century hermit who had famously been tempted by demons in the desert. When the young man touched the relic, he experienced relief and eventually recovered. Grateful, Gaston founded a monastic order dedicated to Saint Anthony, with the specific mission of caring for those suffering from what came to be called St. Anthony's fire. The Order of St. Anthony built hospitals across Europe, eventually operating more than 370 facilities in France, Germany, Spain, Italy and beyond. These hospitals were sometimes called hôpitaux des démembrés, hospitals of the dismembered, because victims would leave their amputated limbs at the entrances as offerings. The monks of the Order of St. Anthony didn't know what caused the disease, but they made an important discovery. Patients who came to their hospitals and ate the food provided there, which often came from different grain sources than what the patients had been eating at home, frequently recovered, or at least stopped getting worse. This recovery was attributed to the miraculous power of St. Anthony's relics and to a special wine made from grapes grown at the abbey in Vienne, France, where the saint's relics were kept. St. Anthony's wine became famous as a cure for ergotism. What was really happening, of course, was that moving patients away from contaminated grain allowed their bodies to clear the ergot alkaloids and prevented further poisoning. The wine might have helped through its alcohol content, which provided calories and possibly some vasodilation that counteracted the extreme vasoconstriction caused by ergot. But the real cure was simply stopping the poisoning. It wasn't until the 17th century that physicians began to make the connection between ergot-contaminated grain and the disease. Even then, the mechanism wasn't understood. Farmers and millers began to recognize that grain with black sclerotia should be discarded. But in times of famine, when the choice was between starvation and eating questionable grain, people ate what they had. Outbreaks continued into the 20th century in some regions. The hallucinations produced by ergotism are particularly significant for our discussion. Ergot alkaloids are chemically related to LSD, which was first synthesized from ergot alkaloids in the 1930s. The hallucinogenic effects are similar in some ways, though ergot hallucinations are complicated by the systemic poisoning and pain. People experiencing ergotism reported vivid visions, both terrifying and transcendent. They saw demons, a recurring theme, and they associated these visions with Saint Anthony, who had famously been tormented by demons in the desert. They saw complex, swirling patterns. They experienced synesthesia, where sensations mixed together. They felt their souls leaving their bodies. They had profound mystical experiences that they interpreted through their religious beliefs. Some historians have suggested that certain outbreaks of strange behavior in medieval and early modern Europe might have been related to ergotism, the dancing manias, outbreaks where groups of people danced uncontrollably for hours or days, might have been partially fueled by ergot poisoning combined with mass hysteria. The Salem witch trials, while primarily a product of social tensions and religious paranoia, might have been influenced by ergotism, as some of the symptoms described by the accusers, convulsions, hallucinations, bizarre behavior, match ergot poisoning. This theory is controversial, and many historians dispute it, but it remains a possibility. What's undeniable is that ergotism was a major source of accidental intoxication and horror in medieval Europe. People weren't seeking altered consciousness when they ate their daily bread. They were trying to survive. But the fungus in their grain transported them to altered states anyway, states of pain and vision and terror. They experienced hallucinations more intense than anything they would have gotten from flying ointments or opium or any deliberately consumed substance. And they did so involuntarily, without preparation, without framework, without anything to help them make sense of what was happening to them. This highlights something important about the medieval experience of intoxication. It wasn't always chosen. It wasn't always recreational or even medicinal in intent. Sometimes it was inflicted by circumstances, by contaminated food, by poverty and desperation and bad luck. The altered states that people experienced weren't always transcendent or pleasurable or even meaningful. Sometimes they were just suffering given a chemical dimension. While most of our discussion has focused on medieval Europe, it's important to acknowledge that drug use in medieval times was not limited to one region or culture. The medieval Islamic world, particularly in places like Egypt, had its own relationship with psychoactive substances, and understanding this provides useful context and contrast. In medieval Egypt, from roughly the 13th through 15th centuries, cannabis use was widespread and culturally significant. Cannabis, known in Arabic simply as the herb, though it had many other nicknames, shrub of emotion, shrub of understanding, peace of mind, branches of bliss, thought morsel, was processed into hashish, a concentrated resin that could be eaten or smoked. Hashish use cut across social boundaries in some ways, but was particularly associated with lower classes by the 15th century. The historian al-Makrizi, writing in the early 1400s, complained bitterly about how widespread hashish use had become. He lamented that character and morals had become overwhelmingly vile, that people had lost all nobility and virtue, that they used foul language and boasted of faults. If it weren't for their human shape, he wrote, nobody would think them human. This is, of course, the classic complaint of every generation about the moral decay caused by the younger generation's vices. But it does indicate that hashish use was common enough to be visible and to cause social concern. Other medieval writers were more positive about hashish. Al-Akbari, a 13th century writer, described hashish use in almost glowing terms. He said that only intelligent and well-to-do people used hashish, and that when taking it, one should consume only the lightest foods and noblest sweets, sit in pleasant places, and surround oneself with distinguished friends. He described users going on and becoming concerned with thinking about sweets and food, assuming all of this is reality, whereas in fact, they were asleep. This description suggests a dreamlike state, a gentle hallucination where reality and imagination blend. The effects of hashish described by medieval users sound familiar. Euphoria, increased appetite, the famous munchies, mild lethargy, enhanced enjoyment of music. These are the classic effects of cannabis that users still report today. The active compound is the same, tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, and the human endocannabinoid system hasn't changed in 800 years, so the subjective experience was likely very similar to what modern cannabis users experience. Hashish was consumed in different settings. Public bathhouses were popular places to use hashish, as were private gatherings of friends. By the 15th century, specific locations became known as places where hashish users, often described as addicts, congregated. This suggests that habitual use was common enough to create a visible subculture, a group of people whose lives centered to some degree around hashish use. Medieval Islamic physicians knew about both the benefits and dangers of cannabis. They used it medically as a diuretic and for other purposes, but they also warned about the bad effects of hashish. One 14th century Egyptian physician, Az-Zarkashi, gave an exhaustive list of hashish's supposed harms. He claimed it destroyed the mind, reduced reproductive capacity, produced elephantiasis, passed on leprosy, attracted disease, caused tremulousness, made the mouth smell foul, dried up semen, caused eyebrows to fall out, burned the blood, caused tooth cavities, brought forth hidden diseases, harmed intestines, made limbs inactive, caused shortness of breath, generated illusions, diminished the powers of the soul, reduced modesty, made the complexion yellow, blackened teeth, riddled the liver with holes, inflamed the stomach and left a bad odour in the mouth, as well as diminished vision and increased pensiveness. This list is clearly exaggerated and combines actual effects, mythical effects, and effects that might be caused by other factors or by extreme chronic use. But it shows that medieval physicians took hashish seriously as a drug that could cause harm. They didn't dismiss it as harmless. They saw it as a powerful substance that needed to be approached with caution. The legal and religious status of hashish in medieval Islamic societies was complex. Unlike alcohol, which the Quran explicitly forbids, cannabis is not mentioned in Islamic scripture. This led to ongoing debates among religious scholars about whether hashish use was permissible. Some argued that any intoxicating substance was forbidden by analogy to alcohol. Others argued that since it wasn't specifically mentioned, it existed in a grey area. The debate continues to this day. What's interesting for our purposes is that medieval Islamic societies had a relationship with cannabis that was more open and more integrated into daily life than most medieval Christian European societies had with any drug except alcohol. Hashish wasn't hidden away or restricted to medical use. It was a social drug used in groups associated with pleasure and relaxation and altered perception. It was also, notably, never associated with witchcraft or demonic activity the way that nightshade-based substances were in Christian Europe. The cultural frameworks were completely different, and this shaped how the drug was understood and used. This contrast is important. It reminds us that the medieval experience of intoxication wasn't universal. Different cultures had access to different substances. They interpreted the effects through different religious and philosophical frameworks. What was forbidden in one place might be tolerated or even celebrated in another. The human desire for altered consciousness appears to be universal, but the substances used and the meanings assigned to those altered states are deeply cultural. So, what did getting high actually feel like in medieval times? We've talked about substances and pharmacology and social contexts, but what about the subjective experience? What was it like to be inside a medieval mind altered by these substances? The truth is, we can only approximate this. We have descriptions from the period, but they're filtered through medieval understandings and language. We have modern pharmacological knowledge about what these substances do to the brain, but that knowledge doesn't fully capture subjective experience. Still, we can reconstruct something, a sense of what it might have felt like. Alcohol intoxication would have felt familiar in most respects. The initial relaxation, the warmth spreading through the limbs, the loosening of inhibitions, the mild euphoria. These are universal effects of ethanol on the human nervous system. But the context would have shaped the experience. In a medieval tavern, surrounded by people you'd known your entire life, with a fire burning in the hearth and a bard singing old songs, with the constant awareness of hardship waiting outside those walls, drunkenness would have felt like a temporary sanctuary. The alcohol didn't transport you somewhere else. It made here more bearable. It softened the edges of a life that was all edges. For someone drinking ale enhanced with henbane, the experience would have been stranger. The initial stage would be like normal drunkenness, but then a dissociative layer would have opened up. The room might have seemed to pulse and breathe. Conversations would have become difficult to follow, words slipping away before you could grasp their meaning. You might have felt like you were rising slightly above your body, looking down at yourself from a small height. Other people's faces might have seemed mask-like, unfamiliar even though you knew them. Time would have stretched and contracted unpredictably. What felt like hours might have been minutes. What felt like minutes might have been hours. And through it all, a strange kind of calm, a dissociation that made you feel like none of it mattered very much, because none of it was quite real. The surgical sedatives, the great rest and dwale, produced something more profound. Within the first 20 minutes after administration, you would have felt the dissociative effects of the henbane or mandrake taking hold. Your body would have started to feel distant, as if it belonged to someone else. Pain signals would have dulled, not disappeared but become less urgent, less you. You might have felt a strange spinning sensation, a tilting of the world. Your vision would have blurred and doubled, sounds would have echoed, and then, as the opium fully kicked in, a deep calm would have settled over everything. The dissociation would have deepened into something like sleep, but not quite sleep. You would have been aware of things happening vaguely, distantly, but unable to engage with them. A surgery being performed on your body would have felt like a surgery being performed on someone else's body in another room. The pain would have been there, but muffled, wrapped in layers of chemical insulation. And woven through it all, the opium's euphoria, a sense that despite everything, despite the violence being done to your flesh, you were fundamentally all right, that some essential you was safe and warm and protected. Coming out of that state would have been disorienting. Consciousness would have returned in stages, like surfacing from deep water. First, sensations, pain primarily, no longer muffled but immediate and sharp. Then awareness of your body, of where you were, of what had been done to you. Then memory, fragmentary at first, images and sensations that didn't quite cohere. You wouldn't remember most of the surgery. You'd remember the beginning, the sponge pressed to your face, the strange taste in your mouth. You'd remember sensations, floating, spinning, voices echoing. You'd remember bits of dreams or visions that might have been hallucinations. But the middle part, the part where the saw cut through bone, that would be blessedly absent. The sedatives would have done their job. The nightshade-based flying ointments produced something entirely different. The onset would have been gradual, building over perhaps 30 minutes to an hour as the alkaloids absorbed through the skin and crossed the blood-brain barrier. First, you might have felt a strange tingling, a lightness in the limbs. Your mouth would have become dry, your heart rate would have increased, vision would have started to blur at the edges, and then the hallucinations would have begun. They wouldn't have started as full-blown visions. They would have started as distortions of what was really there. The shadows in the corners would have moved, the texture of the wall would have seemed to ripple. Objects would have appeared closer or farther than they really were. And then, gradually, the hallucinations would have become more complex, more independent of external reality. You might have seen people who weren't there. You might have had entire conversations with them, believing completely that they were real. You might have believed you were somewhere else entirely, not in your cottage, but in a forest clearing, at a crossroads, on a mountaintop. The sensation of flying, so consistently reported, would have been a proprioceptive hallucination, a false signal from your body about its position in space. You would have felt yourself lifting off the ground, felt the wind on your face, felt yourself moving through air at incredible speed. It would have been utterly convincing, and if you'd been applying the ointment expecting or fearing that you might fly, That expectation would have shaped the hallucination, making it fit the cultural narrative of the witch's Sabbath. The experience would have been terrifying and ecstatic in equal measure. Terrifying because you would have lost all sense of control, all ability to distinguish reality from illusion. Ecstatic because the flight, the transformation, the sense of being transported beyond normal existence would have been thrilling in a way that nothing else in medieval life could match. And all of it would have felt absolutely real until it didn't. Until you came back down, until you woke up, hours later, exhausted and confused, with only the dimmest memory of where you'd been. Ergot poisoning produced perhaps the most horrific altered states of all, because unlike the other substances we've discussed, ergotism combined hallucinations with intense physical suffering. The burning sensation in your extremities would have been excruciating, all-consuming. It would have felt like your hands and feet were being held in fire, like your flesh was being consumed from within. You would have been unable to think about anything else, unable to sleep, unable to eat. And on top of that physical agony, you would have had hallucinations. You would have seen things that weren't there. Demons, most commonly, creatures with twisted faces and malevolent eyes, creatures that seemed to be causing your pain. You might have seen the flesh melting off your bones, seen insects burrowing under your skin. You might have believed you were in hell, that you died and been condemned to eternal torment. The convulsions would have racked your body, causing you to dance or writhe uncontrollably. You might have spoken in tongues, babbled prophecies, screamed warnings, and through all of this, you would have had no framework to understand what was happening. You wouldn't have known about fungal contamination or alkaloid poisoning. You would have searched for meaning in your suffering. Maybe you'd sinned and God was punishing you. Maybe someone had cursed you. Maybe demons were dragging you to hell. The physical and psychological suffering would have reinforced each other in a terrible feedback loop. The hallucinations would have made the pain more frightening. The pain would have made the hallucinations more vivid and more horrific. For those who survived ergotism, and many didn't, the experience would have been permanently scarring. Not just physically, though the loss of limbs was scary enough, but psychologically. You would have been to a place of pure suffering, a place where reality itself dissolved into nightmare. You would carry that memory forever. The contrast between these different altered states is striking. Alcohol provided relief, a gentle softening. Opium provided euphoria and pain relief. The nightshades provided visions and transcendence, but also terror and confusion. Ergot provided only suffering with hallucinations layered on top. The experiences ranged from pleasant to neutral to horrific, but all were journeys away from normal consciousness. All were escapes from ordinary reality, even when that escape led somewhere worse. What's most important to understand is that medieval people experiencing these altered states didn't have the luxury of our modern detachment. They couldn't say to themselves, "I'm just high, this will pass, it's just the drugs." For them, these experiences were revelations about the nature of reality. A vision seen under the influence of henbane was as valid as any other vision, maybe more valid because it came from an altered state that might bring you closer to the spiritual realm. The terror induced by belladonna was real terror, demonic terror. The euphoria of opium was a glimpse of the peace of heaven. The burning of ergot was the fire of hell or purgatory made manifest in flesh. And because these experiences were interpreted through religious frameworks, they carried moral weight. Getting high wasn't value neutral, it was spiritually significant. It might be a sin, or it might be a sacrament, depending on context and interpretation. This is why the medieval relationship with intoxication was so complex and so fraught. Every altered state was potentially a test, a temptation, a revelation, or a condemnation. Medieval society's attitudes toward intoxication were complicated and often contradictory. There was no single medieval view on drugs any more than there's a single modern view. Different groups had different perspectives. Different substances were treated differently, and the line between acceptable and unacceptable use was constantly being negotiated. Alcohol was widely accepted because it was ubiquitous and because it had economic and nutritional importance. But drunkenness, especially public drunkenness, was condemned by religious authorities, even as those same authorities were often drunk themselves. The Church taught that moderation was a virtue and that excess was a sin, but they also acknowledged that wine was a gift from God, that Christ's first miracle was turning water into wine, that wine was essential for the Eucharist. So drinking was good, but drinking too much was bad, and where exactly that line fell was perpetually under debate. Opium and other medicinal substances occupied a grey area. When used by physicians for legitimate medical purposes, they were not just acceptable but necessary. Pain relief was seen as a moral good, an act of mercy. Allowing someone to suffer when you had the means to ease their suffering was considered cruel. So, opium given to a patient in pain was medicine, not intoxication. But the same substance taken for pleasure, or taken in larger doses than medically necessary, or taken without a physician's supervision, that might be considered abuse. And again, the boundaries were unclear. The nightshades were more problematic. Their association with sedation and surgery gave them medical legitimacy. But their association with hallucinations, with visions, with states that resembled demonic possession made them suspect. And once they became associated with witchcraft in the late medieval and early modern periods, they were completely demonized. Possessing flying ointments, or even possessing the ingredients to make them, could get you accused of witchcraft, tortured and burned at the stake. Social class played a major role in determining what was acceptable. The wealthy could drink fine wines and imported spirits without much social sanction. They could access medical opium when needed. Their intoxication, as long as it remained behind closed doors, was largely their own business. The poor drinking cheap ale in taverns, getting publicly drunk, causing disturbances, faced much more scrutiny and punishment. A drunk lord was indulging, a drunk peasant was a public nuisance. Gender was even more significant. Men drinking in taverns was normal, expected, even celebrated as masculine bonding. Women drinking to excess was scandalous, evidence of loose morals and lack of virtue. Women who possessed knowledge of psychoactive plants, who brewed potions and mixed ointments, were particularly suspect. The wise woman, the herbalist, the midwife. These figures sat at the intersection of necessity and danger. They were needed especially by other women for their knowledge of plants that could ease childbirth, prevent conception, end pregnancies, treat female complaints, but that same knowledge could be recast as witchcraft. The line between herbalist and witch was often just a matter of who was doing the accusing and why. The economic aspects of drug use can't be ignored. Brewing and selling ale was a major industry in medieval Europe, employing thousands of people and generating significant tax revenue for towns and kingdoms. Wine production was central to monastic economies. The trade in spices and medicinal substances from the East, including opium, was a driver of commerce and exploration. There were powerful economic interests invested in maintaining the flow of these substances, even as religious authorities condemned their misuse. Addiction, though not understood in modern medical terms, was recognized as a problem. Medieval writers describe people who couldn't stop drinking, who prioritized alcohol over food and family, whose lives were destroyed by their consumption. They describe opium users who needed increasing doses, who suffered when they couldn't get the drug. They describe hashish addicts in medieval Egypt who congregated in specific places to feed their habits. The language used was moral rather than medical, speaking of weakness and sin rather than disease, but the phenomenon they were describing is recognizable. Treatment for what we'd call substance abuse was limited and often ineffective. Religious counseling and penance were the primary approaches. You confessed your sin of drunkenness or gluttony. You did penance. You prayed for strength to resist temptation. For the wealthy, removal to a monastery for a period of enforced sobriety might be an option. For the poor, there was little help available. If your drinking or drug use became too problematic, you might face social exclusion, loss of work, even imprisonment, or worse, punishment. What's striking from a modern perspective is how little distinction was made between different types of substance use. Someone drinking themselves to death on ale was treated essentially the same as someone suffering from ergot poisoning through no fault of their own. Both were understood primarily through moral frameworks. Both were seen as spiritual problems requiring spiritual solutions. The idea that substance use might be a medical issue, that addiction might be a disease rather than a moral failing, that altered states might be studied scientifically rather than judged religiously. These ideas were still centuries away, and yet, underneath all the moral condemnation and religious interpretation, there's evidence that medieval people understood the human need for altered consciousness, the desire to escape, to transcend, to feel differently than normal. The persistence of drinking despite condemnation, the continued use of psychoactive plants despite danger, the willingness of people to risk death or damnation for a few hours of a different kind of consciousness, all of this suggests that the pull of intoxication was powerful enough to overcome fear and social sanction. The knowledge that made medieval intoxication possible was preserved and transmitted by specific groups of people, often working against significant obstacles. Understanding who kept this knowledge and how they passed it on reveals much about medieval society. Monks and monasteries were the primary keepers of pharmaceutical knowledge throughout the medieval period. Monasteries had libraries where ancient texts were copied and preserved. They had herbaria where medicinal plants were cultivated. They had infirmaries where the sick were treated. Monastic physicians studied the works of ancient Greek and Roman writers like Galen, Dioscorides, and Hippocrates. They learned from Arabic medical texts that had been translated into Latin, texts that preserved and extended classical knowledge. The monks had several advantages. They were educated, able to read Latin and sometimes Greek and Arabic. They had stability, remaining in one place for years or decades, which allowed them to build up expertise. They had resources, the wealth of the monastery, and the labour of the community to support their work. And they had a divine mandate, a religious duty to care for the sick and suffering that justified their accumulation of medical knowledge. The pharmaceutical recipes that monks copied and refined included preparations of opium, henbane, mandrake, and countless other medicinal plants. They noted dosages, preparation methods, and effects. They experimented carefully and cautiously, adjusting recipes based on results. The medical knowledge preserved in monastic libraries was the foundation of medieval pharmacy. Without the monks, much of this knowledge would have been lost when the classical world collapsed. But monks weren't the only keepers of pharmaceutical knowledge. Wise women, village healers, herbalists, midwives. These women possessed practical knowledge that was often more extensive than what the monks had. They knew which plants grew where and when. They knew how to identify species and prepare remedies. They knew the uses of hundreds of plants, passed down through oral tradition from mother to daughter, from healer to apprentice. This knowledge was gendered female in part because it concerned women's health, childbirth and menstruation and fertility, and all the things that happened in women's bodies that men didn't fully understand. But it was also gendered female because it was domestic knowledge associated with the home, the hearth, the garden. Women were expected to tend the sick in their families. They were expected to know how to make healing teas and poultices and ointments. The wise woman was simply someone who was particularly good at this, who had a gift for healing, who knew more than her neighbours. The problem for wise women was that their knowledge was transmitted orally and practically, not through written texts. When a wise woman died without passing on her knowledge, that knowledge died with her. And increasingly, especially in the late medieval and early modern periods, wise women came under suspicion. Their knowledge of plants, especially plants that could be used as poisons or abortifacients or intoxicants, made them suspect. The line between healer and witch became increasingly dangerous to walk. Court physicians and university-trained doctors were another group that possessed pharmaceutical knowledge. These were men, always men in medieval Europe, who had formal education in medicine. They studied at universities, learned Galenic theory, memorized elaborate systems of humours and elements. Their knowledge was bookish and theoretical in ways that practical healers' knowledge was not. They could tell you the proper preparation of theriac, a complex compound medicine containing dozens of ingredients, but they might never have actually made it themselves. Court physicians served the wealthy and powerful. They had access to expensive and exotic substances. They could prescribe remedies that were beyond the reach of ordinary people. Their social position gave them authority. When they wrote about drugs and their effects, their words were preserved in manuscripts and later in printed books. Much of what we know about medieval pharmacy comes from these elite medical texts. But court physicians were often less effective than village healers when it came to practical outcomes. Their theoretical knowledge didn't always translate to better patient care. The wise woman who had treated hundreds of similar cases through experience might well have been more skilled than the physician who had studied books but seen few actual patients. The transmission of knowledge also happened through trade networks. Merchants who dealt in spices, medicinal herbs, and other valuable commodities carried knowledge along with goods. They knew what was available where, what was in demand, how to identify quality products. The spice trade that brought black pepper and cinnamon to Europe also brought opium, hashish, and other psychoactive substances. The merchants who facilitated this trade were links in a chain of knowledge that stretched from China to England. Herbals, illustrated books describing medicinal plants, were crucial for transmitting botanical knowledge. These books combined text and images, allowing readers to identify plants they might never have seen before. The images were stylized, often inaccurate by modern botanical standards, but they conveyed enough information to be useful. Herbals circulated among the educated elite, and their contents eventually filtered down to less educated practitioners through various routes. What's remarkable is the continuity of this knowledge. Recipes for sedatives like the Great Rest remained essentially unchanged for centuries. The wisdom embedded in these recipes, the understanding that certain plant combinations worked synergistically, that dosages mattered, that preparation methods affected potency. This wisdom was preserved across generations despite plague, war, and the collapse of civilizations. It represents a genuinely impressive achievement of pre-modern science, but this knowledge was always contested. The Church was suspicious of any knowledge that seemed to bypass divine authority. Secular authorities were concerned about poisons and about substances that could be used for criminal purposes, and as the medieval period gave way to the early modern period, as witch hunts intensified, the knowledge held by village healers became increasingly dangerous to possess. The irony is that much of the knowledge about psychoactive plants was ultimately lost, or at least suppressed for centuries. The wise women who might have taught us about the proper use of nightshades were burned as witches. The traditions of using altered states for healing or spiritual insight were demonized, and modern medicine, when it eventually developed pharmaceutical versions of medieval remedies, often had to rediscover knowledge that had been lost. As we've journeyed through the medieval pharmacopoeia, exploring substances from humble ale to terrifying ergot, from medicinal opium to hallucinogenic flying ointments, A picture has emerged of a complex relationship between human beings and intoxication. Medieval people sought altered consciousness for many reasons: to ease pain, to escape hardship, to find transcendence, to treat illness, to experience the divine, to simply feel different for a few hours. The substances they used, the experiences those substances produced, and the meanings they assigned to those experiences were all deeply embedded in their culture, their beliefs, their hopes and fears. What's striking is how much has changed and how much has remained the same. We have different substances now, synthetic compounds that medieval people couldn't have imagined. We have different frameworks for understanding intoxication, medical and psychological rather than primarily religious. We have different legal and social structures around drug use. But the fundamental human desire to alter consciousness, to journey beyond ordinary waking reality, that hasn't changed. Neither has the capacity of chemicals to produce profound and sometimes terrifying effects on the mind. The medieval approach to intoxication, for all its limitations, had some advantages over our modern approach. Medieval people understood that the line between medicine and recreation was blurry, that pain relief and pleasure weren't opposed but connected. They understood that set and setting, though they wouldn't have used those terms, shaped the experience of intoxication. They understood that substances were dangerous and needed to be treated with respect. And they understood that altered states could be meaningful, could carry spiritual significance, could teach you something about yourself or the world. They also, of course, had significant disadvantages. Their lack of pharmacological knowledge led to many deaths from overdoses, poisonings, and misuse. Their moral frameworks often prevented them from helping those who needed help with addiction or abuse. Their tendency to interpret experiences through religious lenses could lead to persecution and violence, particularly against women accused of witchcraft. And their acceptance of alcohol, to the degree they did, probably caused immense suffering through alcoholism, even if they didn't recognize it as such. Looking at medieval intoxication from our modern perspective is a reminder that drug use is not just an individual choice or a medical issue or a legal problem. It's all of those things and more. It's a deeply human activity that reflects and shapes culture, belief, knowledge, and power. The medieval drunk in the tavern, the monk brewing medicinal wine, the wise woman mixing her ointments, the peasant unknowingly eating contaminated bread, they were all navigating the same fundamental human question: how do we live with consciousness? How do we manage pain, both physical and existential? How do we find meaning and transcendence and joy in a world that often seems designed to crush us? The substances they used were products of their environment, their geography, their botanical knowledge. The experiences they had were shaped by their expectations, their beliefs, their culture. The consequences they faced, social, legal, physical, spiritual, were determined by the structures of power in their world. All of this is still true today. We still use what's available to us. Our experiences are still shaped by our culture. We still face consequences determined by power structures. The specifics have changed. The fundamentals haven't. Perhaps the most important lesson from medieval intoxication is this: altered consciousness has always been part of the human experience and always will be. People will continue to seek it, whether through alcohol, through drugs, through meditation, through religion, through sex, through danger, through art. Trying to eliminate the desire for altered states is futile. What we can do is try to understand it better, to make it safer, to create frameworks that allow people to explore consciousness while minimizing harm. Medieval people, for all their limitations, understood something about this. They knew that the desire was real and powerful. They knew that people would take risks to satisfy it. They tried, sometimes clumsily, sometimes destructively, but they tried to create systems that acknowledged this while maintaining social order and moral values. We're still trying to figure out that balance. Maybe looking back at how our ancestors dealt with these same fundamental questions can teach us something. Not that we should emulate medieval approaches, certainly not all of them, but that we should recognize we're not the first to grapple with these issues, and we can learn from both their successes and their failures. If you've made it this far, thank you for taking this journey with me through the pharmacological landscape of medieval Europe and beyond. If you found this exploration interesting, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, or tell me what other historical topics you'd like to explore. The medieval world, for all its distance from us in time and culture, was inhabited by people who were fundamentally like us. They felt pain and sought relief. They experienced boredom and sought excitement. They faced existential dread and sought meaning. They were curious about the boundaries of consciousness and willing to risk danger to explore them. They were human in all that implies. The substances they used, from the ale that sustained them daily to the nightshades that transported them to other realms, were tools they employed to navigate the challenge of being human. Some tools were relatively safe, others were terrifyingly dangerous. All were woven into the fabric of medieval life in ways that shape society, culture, and individual experience. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of medieval taverns filled with song and ale, of monastery gardens where poppies nod in the breeze, of wise women gathering herbs by moonlight, of visions that blur the boundary between this world and the next. The medieval world was stranger and more complex than we often imagine. Its relationship with intoxication was just one thread in that complexity, but following that thread reveals truths about what it means to be human that transcend any particular time or place. Sweet dreams, and may your journeys, whether in sleep or waking, be enlightening and safe. Until next time.